The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it lingers, pressing its cold palms against the glass as if trying to force its way into a life that has already been locked away. I stand here, right by the fogged up window of my studio apartment in Capitol Hill. My reflection in the glass shows an older woman with silver streaked hair wearing a worn out wool cardigan. If you looked at me from the outside, you would see a quiet, forgotten widow riding out her autumn years on a fixed budget. But down here on the screen of my battered laptop, a quiet Excel sheet glows in the dim room. Column after column of clean numbers, rental income flowing in like clockwork from 14 commercial townhouses scattered across Washington and Oregon. Total unencumbered valuation, $18,500,000. Nobody in this city knows that the little old lady in Unit 4B owns these blocks. And for 5 years, I preferred it that way. Silence, after all, is a very profitable currency. People hear the word divorce and they think of shattered wine glasses and late-night tears. My divorce wasn't like that. It was cold, clinical, and executed with the precision of a guillotine. 5 years ago, Richard Vance, my husband of 30 years, decided that a woman who had spent 30 decades building his logistics empire alongside him had suddenly become obsolete. He wanted a younger face to stand beside him at corporate boardrooms. He wanted to trade 30 years of shared history for a 28-year-old trophy. I remember the courtroom air. It smelled of expensive floor wax. I remember Richard sitting across the mahogany table, looking at me not as a wife, but as an annoying paperwork obstacle. But what still echoes in the hollows of my ribs isn't Richard's betrayal. It was my son. Julian was 26 then. He had my eyes, but his father's ambition, an ambition stripped of any loyalty. He sat in that courtroom wearing a custom-tailored suit paid for by his father's capital, holding a fountain pen as if it were a scepter. When my attorney hesitated, trying to push for a fair division of the estate, Julian leaned across the partition. He didn't look at me with anger. He looked at me with a cold corporate pity. He slid the final settlement papers across the polished oak table, his voice completely devoid of warmth. Mother, you chose to cling to outdated, obsolete values while the world moved on. Just take the $150,000 severance check, sign the quitclaim deed, and stop embarrassing the Vance family name. $150,000. That was the price tag they slapped on 30 years of my youth, 30 years of late nights balancing payrolls when Richard had nothing, and my own flesh and blood. The boy I had protected and loved not only co-signed that execution order, but helped drive the stake into the ground. He took his father's side for a guaranteed executive stock grant worth $2.5 million. I didn't cry. Not a single tear fell on that polished courtroom floor. When you're hit with a blow that absolute, tears are a luxury for people who still believe the world is fair. I knew crying would only feed their arrogance. So I did something they never expected. I took the check, I signed my name at the bottom of their insult, I took the small, honorable payout, walked out of that courthouse into the persistent Seattle drizzle, and vanished into the shadows of Capitol Hill. With that modest sum, I poured every single cent into a market most people are terrified of: distressed commercial properties. While Richard and Julian were busy inflating their egos, I spent my days walking through abandoned retail spaces, negotiating with desperate banks, and buying up neglected storefronts for pennies on the dollar. I became a ghost with a calculator. While they built a house of cards on corporate vanity, I built an empire out of concrete, steel, and unglamorous lease agreements. 5 years passed in total silence. I watched them from afar through financial journals. Richard's company grew louder. Julian moved into a sprawling glass-front mansion in Bellevue, driving imported sports cars and marrying into high society. To the world, they were untouchable. They thought I was living out my days in poverty, regretting the day I walked away from the Vance fortune. They had no idea that the foundation beneath their feet was hollow, and they certainly had no idea that the ghost they left behind was about to step back into the light. The silence of my Capitol Hill apartment was broken on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, exactly 5 years after I had walked out of that courtroom. A heavy, low-frequency rumble vibrated through the thin walls of my building, the unmistakable sound of a 12-cylinder engine idling on the narrow street below. I stepped to the window and looked down. Parked right in front of the rusted municipal trash bins was a gleaming obsidian Range Rover autobiography, a machine carrying a retail price tag of $145,000. A moment later, the buzzer to my unit rattled. When I unlocked the heavy wooden door, my son Julian stood in the dim, narrow hallway. He was 26 when he helped exile me from our family. Now he was 31, carrying the polished, arrogant posture of a senior corporate vice president. He wore a custom-tailored navy blue Brioni suit that easily cost $6,000. His silk tie knotted with absolute precision. He didn't look around the hallway. He just pushed past me into my 45-square-meter studio, his eyes sweeping over my worn-out furniture with undisguised contempt. Without a word, he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope embossed with shimmering gold calligraphy, and tossed it onto my small, chipped laminate kitchen table. It landed with a dry, hollow thud. I didn't touch it immediately. I walked over to the small counter, picked up my ceramic kettle, and poured hot water over a loose tea leaf, letting the steam rise between us. Julian didn't wait for an invitation. He stood in the center of my tiny living room, checking his expensive wristwatch as if measuring how many seconds of his valuable time he was wasting in my presence. "Open it," Julian said, his voice flat, carrying the bored authority of a man accustomed to giving orders that everyone obeyed. I picked up the envelope and slid out the heavy cardstock. The gold lettering gleamed under my single overhead bulb. It was a formal wedding invitation. The names embossed across the front were crisp and undeniable: Julian Vance and Chloe Sterling. The venue was the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle, a 5-star landmark where the ballroom rental alone cost more than most working families earn in a year. Industry insiders estimated the entire wedding production would clear $220,000. I traced my thumb over the raised lettering, feeling the texture of a world I intentionally left behind. I looked up at my son. Julian continued, his tone shifting from bored to a practiced, PR-friendly condescension. "Chloe wants you there. The wedding's going to be covered by regional business journals and lifestyle magazines. She's curating the ultimate image of a modern, successful corporate dynasty. Having both sides of the family present completes the narrative. But she has strict standards, Mother. You can't show up looking like a local charity case, and you certainly can't drive that battered electric hatchback of yours to the Grand Valet of the Fairmont. People will be watching." I remained silent, keeping my face smooth, watching the way his jaw twitched with the same nervous impatience his father used to have when a deal was stalling. Julian took a step closer to the table, lowering his voice into a transactional, matter-of-fact register, as if he were negotiating a minor real estate add-on. "And one more thing. Chloe just secured a penthouse in Bellevue valued at $2.8 million. To lock in the closing terms, we need a preliminary goodwill deposit. Chloe insists that as your contribution to our new life, you will wire $75,000 to our joint escrow account by Friday morning." $75,000. Just like that. Not a request, not a plea, but an invoice handed down from a son who had spent 5 years pretending I didn't exist, now returning only because my presence could serve as a prop for his fiancée's social media branding, and because they needed a cash injection to pad their luxury lifestyle. If this had happened 10 years ago, perhaps my hands would have shaken. Perhaps I would have argued, defended my honor, or reminded him of the blood and sweat I spent raising him. But age and survival teach you the value of absolute quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw the invitation back in his face. I simply turned back to my kettle, took a slow, deliberate sip of my Earl tea, and let the silence stretch between us until the tension began to fray at the edges of his expensive collar. I set the ceramic cup down, looked him dead in the eye, and let my voice drop into a calm, steady register. "I will be there," I said softly. "Give me 1 week to get my affairs in order." Julian let out a sharp, dismissive breath, a half-chuckle of arrogant relief, assuming my compliance was just the pathetic reflex of a lonely old woman desperate for scraps of his son's attention. He didn't say goodbye. He turned on his heel, adjusted his Brioni cuffs, and walked out of the apartment, leaving the heavy oak door swinging open on its hinge. I stood by the window and watched him get back into his 6-figure SUV, listening to the heavy roar of the engine as it pulled away from the curb. He left behind a thick trail of exhaust fumes, a gold-embossed invitation, and an echo of unmatched, staggering human ingratitude. He had no idea what was waiting for him at the end of that week. 2 days after Julian left my apartment with his hollow demands, the illusion of civilized distance was shattered completely. It was a damp Thursday morning. I was sitting at my small laminate table reviewing a digital portfolio of a commercial storefront in Portland when the front door of my building buzzed violently, not once, but in a long, aggressive stream. Before I could even stand up to check the intercom, a sharp, rhythmic pounding echoed against my wooden door, followed by the clatter of expensive heels and a muffled voice directing someone to adjust a camera angle in the narrow corridor. The door didn't just open, it was pushed wide open by a building property manager who had clearly been charmed or bribed into compliance in the hallway. Chloe Sterling stepped across my threshold as if she were inspecting a condemned property. She wasn't alone. Behind her squeezed a young man holding a professional gimbal-mounted camera, its red tally light glowing brightly, streaming live to thousands of eager digital spectators across multiple online platforms. Chloe wore a cream-colored Chanel tweed dress that reeked of exclusive boutiques, her blonde hair styled into immaculate cascading waves. But the sight of her designer apparel only heightened the jarring absurdity of her presence in a compact 45-square-meter studio. The moment she stepped onto my worn linoleum floor, she pulled a pristine hospital-white disinfectant wipe from her designer handbag. Every single object her gloved fingers brushed against, the edge of my bookshelf, the back of my kitchen chair, the handle of my ceramic kettle, was met with an exaggerated shudder of disgust, as if my entire existence was a biohazard to be quarantined. She leaned right into the wide-angle lens of the camera, her voice dripping with performative pity and venomous condescension for her live stream audience. "Look at this, everyone. This is where Julian's mother chooses to live, tucked away in this absolute slum of Capitol Hill. Can you actually believe it? Thank God Julian had the good sense to cut ties with this toxic poverty years ago. Some people are just born to rot in the dark." Comments were scrolling past at lightning speed on the monitor attached to the camera, a rapid waterfall of digital cruelty. So pathetic. What a leech. Cut her off completely. The internet was feasting on my humiliation, orchestrated entirely for the cheap amusement of strangers. Chloe didn't bother lowering her voice or pretending she was visiting family. She turned away from the camera, walked right up to my small wooden table where my laptop was resting, and slammed her manicured palm down onto the surface. The videographer adjusted his zoom, capturing every twitch of her expression as she delivered her final ultimatum directly into the live feed, her tone turning cold and transactional. "Let's get one thing straight right now, Eleanor. If you don't wire that $75,000 deposit for our Bellevue penthouse by Friday morning as promised, I am personally stripping your name off the honorary seating chart at the Fairmont. And don't even think about trying to crawl back into our lives later. You will never, under any circumstances, lay eyes on the surrogate baby I am carrying for Julian. You don't deserve grandchildren." She used an unborn child, a future life, as a bargaining chip, wielding family lineage like a loaded weapon on a public live stream to break my resolve and force my compliance through sheer public shaming. If she had expected me to scream, to burst into tears, or to lunge her camera in a desperate defense of my dignity, she miscalculated entirely. I didn't yell. I didn't utter a single syllable of self-defense. I simply stood up from my chair, walked around the table with measured, unhurried steps, and stepped directly into the frame of the glowing camera. With a calm, deliberate motion, I reached out my hand and pressed my thumb firmly over the lens of the recording device, plunging the live stream instantly into complete blackness. Before Chloe could recover from her shock, I took her by the elbow, not violently but with an unyielding, irresistible physical authority, and guided her straight towards the open doorway. I pushed her past the startled videographer out into the hallway, and with a quiet, solid click, I latched the heavy deadbolt shut behind her. No parting insults, no wasted breath, just absolute, chilling closure. Within minutes, the clip of my hand covering the camera went viral across local social media groups and wedding forums. The digital mob exploded with vicious commentary, labeling me as a bitter, jealous, and unstable mother trying to ruin her son's fairy tale wedding. Thousands of strangers hurled digital stones at my name, completely convinced they were watching a tragedy of a helpless, impoverished old woman losing control. Let them talk. Let the internet fill its lungs with outrage and self-righteous fury. Every single hostile comment, every shared video clip, and every public humiliation they engineered was just another layer of kindling. They were writing the script for their own undoing. The digital noise from Chloe's live stream faded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a cold, purposeful silence in my Capitol Hill apartment. I didn't care about the online backlash or the digital stones hurled by strangers. In business, as in life, when your opponent is busy exposing their own arrogance, you never interrupt them. You simply prepare your counterstrike. Within 2 hours of locking my apartment door, I left and drove downtown through the steady, gray Seattle mist. I walked past the gleaming corporate skyscrapers until I reached a discreet office building on 4th Avenue, marked with a modest frosted glass plaque, Blackwood and Associates, Private Investigations and Financial Intelligence. I didn't schedule an appointment through a secretary or wait in a plush reception lounge. I walked straight into the private consultation room and placed a heavy brown envelope filled with crisp $100 bills on the mahogany desk of Marcus Blackwood, a veteran investigator whose eyes had seen every form of corporate and domestic deception known to the Pacific Northwest. $12,000, I said, my voice steady, low, and completely devoid of emotion. That represents the exact cash surplus generated by my commercial real estate portfolio last month. I want a complete, unbroken background profile on Chloe Sterling. Dig up every financial footprint, every hidden legal dispute, and every engagement ring she has ever worn across state lines. Marcus raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised by the composure of an older woman, dropping a substantial cash retainer without flinching. But he took the envelope and slid it into his desk drawer. "Give us 48 hours, Mrs. Vance. If there are skeletons buried in her closet, we'll find the blueprints." True to his word, exactly 48 hours later, a secure encrypted digital file landed in my inbox. I sat at my laptop under the single overhead light, turning the pages of her real life, a life far removed from the high society fairy tale she was selling to my son and the public. Chloe Sterling was not a wealthy heiress from an old-money Chicago dynasty. She was a professional predator, a serial gold digger who had perfected the art of engineering upscale engagements to extract maximum financial leverage before disappearing into the legal shadows. Marcus's report laid out a systemic financial destruction. 3 previous engagements to wealthy heirs in Chicago and San Francisco, all of which ended identically. In every single case, the targets found themselves slapped with sudden lawsuits, asset freezes, and severe financial settlements just weeks before the wedding bells were scheduled to ring. She didn't want a husband, she wanted a complete liquidation event. However, as I scrolled further down the encrypted pages, the real danger came to sharp focus, and it reached far deeper than Julian's blind arrogance. Attached to the dossier was a confidential financial tracking report involving my ex-husband, Richard Vance. Somehow, through a web of high-stakes manipulation and late-night gambling excursions in Las Vegas, Chloe had trapped Richard into standing as the primary personal guarantor for a staggering $3.5 million private loan from an underground Nevada credit syndicate. More damning than the debt itself were a series of encrypted audio transcripts, conversations where Richard, intoxicated and compromised, openly discussed insider market manipulation, tax evasion schemes, and strategic asset shuffling within Vance Corp. Chloe had recorded every word. She didn't just hold a leash on my foolish son, she held a loaded gun pointed directly at the heart of my ex-husband's entire corporate empire. She was planning to bleed the entire Vance family dry, taking everything Richard had built and everything Julian expected to inherit, leaving them both financially annihilated before skipping the country with the multi-million-dollar spoils. They thought they were the ones pulling the strings, orchestrating a grand social spectacle to humiliate a retired, forgotten woman. They had no idea they were dancing on the edge of a sheer cliff, and the ground beneath their feet was about to give way completely. I closed the dossier, picked up my encrypted burner phone, and dialed a direct saved number that hadn't been used in years. Arthur Pendleton, the sharpest family law and corporate trust attorney in Washington state, answered on the second ring. He didn't ask questions. He knew my voice and he knew my mind. I gave him his instructions with absolute clarity. Pull the original prenuptial agreement Julian signed when he entered the family business holdings, activate the emergency asset freeze clauses, and file the strict legal injunctions for the circuit court by Monday morning. Arthur simply agreed, his voice calm over the secure line, asking if he should notify my ex-husband or my son immediately. I looked out the window at the glittering, rain-slicked skyline of Seattle, letting a thin, cold smile touch my lips before giving him my final, definitive order. No, let them walk right up to the altar. Let them believe they've won everything. The higher they climb, the harder the fall will be. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel was a masterclass in blinding, ostentatious wealth. Thousands of imported white Ecuadorian roses cascaded from the towering crystal chandeliers, and the air carried the heavy, intoxicating scent of expensive perfume and blooming stems. 200 of Seattle's elite financial executives, tech founders, corporate power brokers, and prominent lifestyle editors filled the room, sipping vintage champagne and speaking in low, self-satisfied tones about the financial merger of the season. At the head of the receiving line stood Julian and Chloe, glowing with the triumphant arrogance of two people who believed they had completely conquered the world. Julian wore a pristine, custom-tailored tuxedo, his hand resting proudly on Chloe's waist as she dazzled the crowd in a custom-beaded, backless designer gown. A few paces away, my ex-husband, Richard Vance, stood stiffly alongside his much younger second wife, deliberately looking away and pretending not to notice as I approached the grand entrance. They all expected me to crawl in through the side door, shivering in shame and wrapped in cheap discount wool. They were profoundly, disastrously mistaken. I did not arrive in my battered electric hatchback, nor did I sneak in through the service corridors to avoid the lenses of the wedding photographers. When my private black Rolls-Royce Phantom 8th glided up to the main hotel portico, the professional valet rushed forward in absolute disbelief to open the heavy rear door. I stepped out onto the red carpet, wrapped in a floor-length vintage black velvet evening cloak that swept the polished marble floor with quiet, unyielding authority. Fastened securely to my left shoulder was an authentic 19th-century Italian royal diamond brooch, a rare historical heirloom worth over $450,000, a private premarital property I had retained from my family's estate long before I ever met Richard, a value my ex-husband had always been too profoundly ignorant to recognize. As I walked through the towering glass doors and into the main ballroom, the low hum of polite conversation began to die down like a receding tide. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the front rows as prominent business leaders recognized the historic diamond catching the crystal light, realizing instantly that the woman walking towards them was not a broken, destitute mother, but a woman of untouchable elegance and concealed power. Chloe's triumphant smile vanished completely from her face. Her expression turned a chalky, furious white as she shoved past several startled guests and intercepted me right in the middle of the crowded reception floor, her voice hissing with venomous panic and public humiliation. "What the hell are you wearing, and where is the $75,000 wire transfer you were supposed to clear this morning? You think you can rent a luxury car and play high society just to humiliate me in front of our investors? Get out of my sight before I have security throw you out on your pathetic ass." She thought she could bully me into submission with a public scene, using her usual tactics of loud intimidation to force my retreat and protect her fragile image. But I didn't flinch, and I didn't raise my voice to match her frantic screeching. I simply looked past her trembling manicured hands, bypassed Julian, who stood frozen in stunned silence beside her, and walked straight past them toward the raised main stage, where the live jazz band was taking a brief intermission. The entire room watched my every step in breathless anticipation. The silence in the ballroom became absolute, save for the faint crackle of the sound system. Every single person in attendance, from the high society guests who had mocked my lifestyle to my former husband who thought he had buried my influence forever, was waiting to see what the poor, forgotten mother would do next. Without breaking stride, I stepped up on the mahogany podium, gently lifted the heavy wireless microphone from its stand, and tapped the metal mesh once. The sharp, crisp feedback echoed cleanly through the state-of-the-art acoustic speakers, silencing the entire room of 200 elite guests. Instantly, every eye in the grand ballroom locked on me. I lifted my chin, looked down at my son and his furious bride standing side by side, and prepared to deliver the final chapter of their magnificent illusion. The low murmur of polite chatter in the grand ballroom died away entirely the moment I stepped up to the mahogany podium and tapped the microphone once. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't let a single trace of anger or theatrical bitterness color my tone. In a world governed by wealth, corporate power, and cold ambition, noise is cheap. Unvarnished numbers, however, are completely lethal. With a simple, deliberate gesture toward the AV technician stationed at the rear of the hall, the massive 200-inch LED display screen suspended directly behind the stage flickered to life, cutting through the festival celebration like a cold blade. The pristine white Ecuadorian roses and romantic wedding displays suddenly stood beneath a towering crystal-clear protection of certified bank wire transfers, casino ledger sheets, confidential private investigator dossiers, and court-sealed bankruptcy documents. Every single elite guest in the room could read the stark, bold headings glowing in bright white letters against the dark background, instantly realizing this was no ordinary wedding toast. I looked out over the sea of stunned, silent faces, my voice carrying smoothly and steadily across the acoustic speakers to walk the room through the precise ledger of their collective undoing, exposing the foundation of lies upon which this entire illusion was built. Starting with the heavy, undeniable financial obligations hidden behind the glamorous facade of this multi-million-dollar celebration, I directed the room's attention to the high-stakes financial tracking reports detailing a $3.5 million private debt issued by an underground credit syndicate in Nevada. It was a staggering liability not incurred by a corporation, but personally guaranteed by my ex-husband, Richard Vance, signed away in the dead of night to cover the secret gambling syndicates and underground credit lines accumulated by our brilliant bride. Gasps rippled through the front rows as Richard stood up so fast his crystal champagne flute shattered on the marble floor, his face turning an alarming, sickly shade of gray while staring at the tracking logs bearing his own signature. Without breaking stride, I scrolled down to certified legal records from 3 separate superior courts across the country, publicly unmasking 3 respectable gentlemen from Chicago and San Francisco. They were the former fiancés of Miss Chloe Sterling, each of their corporate accounts systematically drained right before catastrophic bankruptcy proceedings left them penniless. Chloe was no heiress to an old money dynasty. She was a serial financial predator whose only true talent was liquidation. Chloe let out a choked, desperate sound, her face turning chalk white as she tried to lunge forward, but Julian caught her arm, frozen in absolute horror. I turned my gaze away from the bride and locked eyes directly with my ex-husband, who was now trembling visibly under the weight of 200 staring eyes, delivering my final, unsparing public judgment. Richard, your precious Vance Corp is currently nothing more than an empty corporate shell, because last week, Chloe quietly executed fraudulent proxy transfers, shifting 40% of your voting shares into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, leaving you completely penniless after a lifetime of trading your family for status. Richard staggered backward, clutching his chest, as the reality of his total corporate ruin crashed down upon him. He had spent a lifetime sacrificing his family for corporate power, only to be stripped of everything by the very woman he welcomed into his home. Finally, I turned my attention to my son. Julian stood paralyzed near the edge of the stage, his tailored Brioni suit looking like a cheap costume as I directed everyone's attention to the forensic accounting breakdown of his personal finances. Without raising my voice, I walked the room through his actual junior executive salary and the mountain of hidden credit card debt and high-interest personal loans accumulated under his name to fund Chloe's lavish lifestyle, revealing every luxury car, designer suit, and high-end asset as leased debt, totaling over $900,000 in personal lines of credit, designed to lock him in a lifelong financial prison that would take 20 lifetimes to clear. Julian stared up at the massive numbers glowing in red on the screen, his knees buckling slightly as the illusion shattered into a million pieces. The wedding of the century had transformed into a public execution of their greed, orchestrated down to the final decimal point by the mother they thought they had buried forever. The grand ballroom erupted into total, breathless chaos, but my gaze remained as cold and steady as winter stone. In the span of a single heartbeat, the glittering illusion of wealth and triumph dissolved into an inescapable nightmare of their own making, proving once and for all that a house built on deception will always collapse under its own weight. Driven completely mad by public exposure and the absolute shattering of her parasitic schemes, Chloe lost every remaining shred of composure. Screaming like a trapped, desperate animal, she picked up a full glass of wine and hurled it straight toward me, the liquid splashing uselessly against the heavy black velvet of my vintage cloak. But she didn't even get the chance to take another step forward. Before she could lunge any further across the platform, two burly hotel security officers intercepted her with professional precision, pinning her arms firmly behind her back as two uniformed Seattle police officers stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway to place her under formal arrest for interstate financial fraud, forgery, and systematic identity theft. Her manic, piercing shrieks echoed violently against the towering crystal chandeliers as she was dragged away in handcuffs, kicking and screaming obscenities, while the 200 elite guests watched in horrified, paralyzed silence, realizing the true nature of the woman they had gathered to celebrate. Right beside her public downfall, the foundations of another monumental failure crumbled completely into dust. My ex-husband, Richard Vance, staggered backward under the crushing weight of reality and collapsed heavily into a velvet reception chair, his hands clutching desperately at his chest as the full scale of his corporate ruin crashed down upon him. He had spent his entire life building a massive logistics empire, ruthlessly sacrificing his family, his integrity, and his soul for corporate dominance, only to realize that his entire logistics fortune had evaporated through a series of blinded, arrogant signatures. He sat there as a broken, penniless man, utterly destroyed by the very con artist he had welcomed into his home in place of the family he abandoned decades ago. Every whispered rumor in the room had vanished, replaced by the deafening silence of a collapsing empire. For years, they had operated under the absolute delusion that power and wealth could permanently shield them from consequence, treating human lives and genuine loyalty as disposable commodities on a balance sheet. But the universe has a quiet, unrelenting way of balancing its accounts when truth is finally brought to light. Chloe's elaborate networks of deceit, carefully constructed over years of manipulation across multiple cities, had unraveled in a matter of minutes under the unblinking lens of concrete evidence, leaving behind but complete ruin. Every single person in this ballroom now understood the terrifying cost of unchecked greed and arrogance. The magnitude of their collective ruin hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder that truth always reclaims what deception tries to steal. They had gambled everything on a foundation of shifting sand, believing their status made them untouchable. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, broken only by the ragged, desperate breathing of men who had lost everything they built in a single night. And then, amidst the smoking wreckage of their grand ambitions, there was my son. Julian dropped violently to his knees right in front of me, his expensive Brioni tuxedo sweeping the polished marble floor as he lunged forward to desperately grab the hem of my evening cloak. His face was stained with hot, bitter tears of utter humiliation and helpless panic, his voice cracking as he choked out broken apologies, begging for mercy, begging for forgiveness, desperately trying to take back every cruel, arrogant word he spat at me when he dismissed me as an obsolete, impoverished burden who didn't belong in his high society world. I stopped walking. I looked down at the young man I had raised, the son who had traded his mother's unconditional love for a designer label and a false promise of superficial status. My heart felt a sharp pang of cold, hollow sorrow, but my eyes remained completely unyielding. I looked into his tear-streaked, devastated face and delivered the final, unsparing verdict. You chose to measure human worth by someone else's bank balance, Julian. So today, you are bankrupt not just of money, but of everything that makes you a person, because you never learned what true character means. Without another word, I pulled the fabric of my cloak away from his trembling fingers, turned around, and walked slowly down the center stage steps. 200 of Seattle's most powerful financial elites parted before me in absolute, breathless silence. Not a single person daring to whisper or look me in the eye as I stepped out into the cool, rain-slicked night, leaving their glittering empire of lies buried forever in the dust. 3 months after the public scandal tore through the grand ballroom, the glittering dynasty of Vance Corp officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The corporate giant that once commanded the entire Northwest logistics sector collapsed like a house of cards under the relentless weight of accumulated financial fraud and systemic corruption. Richard Vance was forced to liquidate the sprawling Bellevue mansion down to its bare walls to satisfy aggressive creditors, retreating into a cramped, depressing studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city where he once ruled. Julian, stripped of his executive title, his luxury sports cars, and his superficial social circle, was shown the door without a safety net and forced to spend grueling 12-hour shifts working at a noisy container freight yard, sweating under heavy shipping crates just to chip away at the towering mountain of personal debt left behind by Chloe's betrayal. Every whispered rumor about their invincible empire vanished into thin air, replaced by the bitter reality of hard labor and quiet survival. For men who had spent their entire lives measuring human dignity by bank statements and corporate titles, the fall was absolute and inescapable. High above the bustling downtown streets, standing on the breezy balcony of my quiet Capitol Hill apartment, the air felt remarkably light and clean. I looked down at the official legal documents resting on the polished wooden table before me. With a steady hand, I signed my name to the founding charter of the Independent Women's Support Fund, the Vance Foundation, allocating an initial $10 million straight from my personal, self-earned real estate portfolio. It wasn't just a charitable organization, it was a sanctuary, a dedicated shield designed to legally protect and financially empower vulnerable victims of psychological abuse, manipulation, and financial marriage fraud who had been discarded by ruthless predators. Life has a strange, quiet way of bringing things full circle, testing whether we have truly absorbed the hard lessons carved out by our survival. Late that rainy afternoon, building security called up to inform me that a young man was waiting down in the lobby, refusing to leave despite the chilling wind. I walked over to the glass window and looked down. It was Julian, standing in the steady drizzle, his clothes soaked through and his posture completely broken. He clutched a crumpled, tear-stained, handwritten letter against his chest. It was a desperate plea, begging for a chance to work without a single penny of pay, day and night for the foundation, just to do something redemptive, just to begin making amends for the arrogance that had blinded him for so long. I didn't turn him away, nor did I offer him the warm comfort of an executive desk or an easy title. I sent down a single instruction through the manager. Julian was given a pair of heavy rubber boots, work gloves, and a mop, assigned permanently to clean, sweep, and scrub the damp, dusty basement storage levels of the foundation headquarters. It wasn't punishment born of bitterness. It was the fundamental first lesson in honest, unpretentious labor, learning the true value of earning one's keep from the ground up, far away from the toxic illusion of inherited privilege. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Seattle skyline in brilliant shades of amber, violet, and deep gold, I stepped back inside and poured a fresh cup of warm chamomile tea. Leaning quietly against the balcony railing, watching the city lights flicker to life across the Puget Sound, a profound sense of absolute peace washed over me. I finally understood the ultimate truth hidden beneath all those years of endurance. True wealth was never about multi-million-dollar corporate accounts, high society validation, or the hollow comfort of a shared last name. True wealth is simply the quiet, uncompromised freedom to stand tall on your own 2 feet and dictate the destination of your own destiny.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away? The courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.